On October the 31st, 1517, Martin Luther posted 95 big questions which he believed faced the church of his day to a local church door in Wittenberg, Germany. 500 years later, I decided to post 95 new questions, one a week, to the web, questions which I believe the church must face in the 21st century. Love God, love others the way you love yourself. That's it. That's what it means to be fully alive. All the rest is just commentary. Last week I explained that according to Jesus, speaking in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, this sums up completely the Old Testament law and prophets with no remainder. And I explained that over the coming weeks I'm going to take a look at some of the implications of this radical and focused approach to spirituality and ethics. But along the way I commented that Jesus was pretty discerning about the texts of the Old Testament that he chooses to quote from. So he ignores some altogether. For instance, he never quotes from the books of Joshua or Judges. This, I suggested, is because they're just packed with violence, much of which is supposedly committed on the orders of God. Jesus, of course, not only doesn't like this aspect of their teaching, he teaches the exact opposite, the practice of non-violence and of peacemaking. Well, some people on social media reacted pretty strongly to what I had to say, whilst others asked more questions. So this week I want to stop just for a while to explore all of this in a little more depth. First, just like many of us, I guess, Jesus had his favourite books of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. He quotes from the Psalms more often than any other text. And then in second place comes Deuteronomy, in third Isaiah, and in fourth place Exodus. But when he does quote from Deuteronomy and Exodus, sometimes he does so approvingly and sometimes to disagree. So in the desert, as he faces temptation, Jesus cries, "Again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." You can read about it in Matthew's Gospel chapter 4, where you find strength from the words of Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 16, which says, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." But on other occasions, Jesus openly contradicts texts with which he disagrees. In what we often call the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches, "You've heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist the evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over to them your coat as well." Here he is first quoting and then disagreeing with a principle set out in Leviticus as well as Exodus and in Deuteronomy. Chapter 19 verse 21 of Deuteronomy reads like this: "You must show no pity for the guilty. Your rule should be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth." Although Jesus says he's come to fulfill the law, his definition of this clearly does not include blind acceptance. In fact, it's clear that here he has a radical disagreement with it. Or to put all this a different way round, he understands that the real fulfilment of the law is grace. Love is, in the end, the only real law. And then there are also times when Jesus cuts and pastes the Old Testament and text from it to suit his purposes. The longest single Old Testament passage Jesus ever quotes is from Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2. The story is told in Luke chapter 4, verses 6 to 20. It reads like this: "On the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it's written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant and sat down. But if you actually look up Isaiah 61, the passage Jesus is reading from, you discover that this is not quite what Isaiah says. Jesus has subverted it. For the first verse, Jesus sticks to the text. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. But then he goes off-piste. He makes it up. His next statements are not what is written on the page or the scroll. Instead, they're a freewheeling, improvised mix of clauses, some based loosely on Isaiah 61, one from Isaiah 58 thrown in to set the oppressed free, and another, the recovery of sight for the blind, most probably a reference to either Isaiah 35 or Isaiah 29. Jesus loves the spirit rather than the letter of the law. But then comes the biggest shocker. Jesus seems to deliberately drop the last clause of the Isaiah passage altogether. Isaiah chapter 61 verse 2 ends with, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour and the day of the vengeance of our God. But Jesus edits out the day of vengeance of our God altogether. He finishes with, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Full stop. Look it up. And then, as Luke tells us, he rolls up the scroll deliberately, gives it back to the attendant, and he sits down. Why? In my view, to make a very clear point. Jesus does not believe in a vengeful God. He knows that there's a bigger arc to the story, and it's one of mercy and justice. It's about restoration, not retribution, one that reveals God as compassionate, non-violent and inclusive of outsiders. Over the years, I've learned that some people will always find the decontextualized, angry Bible verse to confirm their obsession with anger at others, especially those who are different to them. But I've realised that others will have the eyes to pick out the thread of mercy, justice, love and hope that calls us all towards a different, a bigger and a greater vision of God. What do you think of what I've said? I'll see you next week.